Today, we're exploring the 1970s, a golden age packed with nostalgic family dinners, bright colors, and brand new products that everyone thought were perfectly safe. We'll uncover 5 once popular foods that ended up banned or heavily restricted later on. Number 1. Sassafras glazed BBQ ribs. Back in the 1970s, a lot of families loved experimenting with homemade sauces inspired by old America's earlier traditions. One surprising twist was to boil real sassafras root and then brush that earthy syrup over slow-cooked pork ribs. It gave the meat a sweet, woodsy bite that people described as completely different from any store-bought sauce. Neighbors would swap recipes at weekend block parties, and baby boomers remember how the whole neighborhood smelled like an impromptu cookout once the grills fired up. Kids might have been indoors watching retro reruns, or flipping through photo albums filled with images of the 1930s and 1940s, hearing stories about how sassafras was a staple back then. By the time the 1970s rolled around, families still believed real sassafras was harmless. After all, old commercials had glamorized various homemade root beers and teas for decades. Over the years, though, researchers discovered saffrole in sassafras might be carcinogenic, leading the FDA to forbid its widespread use as a food additive. Folks looking back on that golden age recall a time when the backyard rocking chair, a loud rock and roll station, and a plateful of sticky sassafras glazed ribs summed up the peak of American nostalgia. These days, you can find saffron-free sassafras flavoring, but that original root-based glaze, the very one that had people licking their fingers at 1970s picnics, is now essentially off-limits. Number 2. Cyclamate sweet and sour chicken. During the mid-20th century, folks craved convenience and novelty in the kitchen. By the 1970s, the baby boomer generation was hosting dinner parties with exotic-sounding recipes like sweet and sour chicken, which often blended tangy pineapple juice, bell peppers, and a sweetener. Cyclamate, first introduced in the 1950s, was a popular low-calorie option. Magazine ads and old commercials made it sound like a miracle ingredient. No guilt, just sweetness. The sauce for this dish typically involved heating pineapple chunks, soy sauce, vinegar, and a packet or two of cyclamate, creating a glossy finish that clung to the chicken in a mouth-watering way. When you flipped on your 1970s TV, you'd see game shows followed by lively ads featuring jingles about sugar substitutes. People were intrigued and more than willing to try them in their home cooking. But just a few years into that era, concerns about potential health risks emerged, and by the end of the 1960s, cyclamate had been banned in the United States. Nonetheless, many households still had leftover boxes of the stuff well into the early 1970s, meaning sweet and sour chicken continued to pop up on dinner tables. Today, going down an internet rabbit hole of old articles and archived recipe books reveals how widely cyclamate was used before the rules changed. Gen X folks remember hearing their parents, or older relatives, insist that cyclamate tasted so much better than other substitutes. Even if it's off the market now, it remains a clear marker of that transition between the carefree vibes of the 1950s and 1960s and the more cautious age that followed. Number 3. Red dye. Number 2. Hot pink meatballs. In the 1970s, colorful dishes were practically a trend in themselves. Everything from jellied fruit molds to rainbow-layered cakes popped off the dinner table. Meatballs were no exception, especially in certain recipe pamphlets that recommended using a sauce laced with red dye number 2 to achieve a playful hot pink hue. It sounds wild today, but back then it felt modern and fun. Families would mix tomato sauce, a little sugar, and a healthy dose of red coloring, simmer the meatballs, and watch them soak up that vivid shade. Scenes of kids running around the kitchen, chairs decked out in orange and brown patterns, and a record player blasting the latest rock tunes form the backdrop of many a 1970s dinner. Baby boomers and Gen Xers, who talk about these meatballs on nostalgic internet forums, describe the dish as half party trick, half comfort food, something that lit up neighborhood potlucks. The trouble was, red dye number 2 eventually became notorious for possible health effects, leading to a major FDA ban in 1976. That sudden change forced candy makers, bakers, and regular home cooks to revamp their recipes in a hurry. People who used it for savory foods like these meatballs either had to switch to different dyes or just give up the bright pink novelty. Old Hollywood fans who tune into vintage cooking segments sometimes stumble across references to this bizarre yet charming recipe. Nowadays, all that remains is the memory of families laughing around a table, poking fun at the color while unknowingly dining on something that regulators later deemed too risky for supermarket shelves. Number 4, shortening crusted country fried steak, loaded with trans fats. Before the widespread crackdown on partially hydrogenated oils, many families in the 1970s relied on vegetable shortening to fry up their favorite dinners. One signature dish was country fried steak, featuring thin cuts of beef dredged in flour, then submerged in a skillet full of sizzling shortening. The result was a crunchy, golden crust that seemed lighter than frying with lard or butter, which people were told to avoid for health reasons. Old commercials for these shortenings promised a healthier option, using phrases like scientifically tested to reel in consumers. Baby boomers recall family kitchens decked out in bold wallpaper and avocado green appliances, with everyone crowding around the table once the steak was done. Gen X kids might have helped whisk up the gravy, pouring in milk to complete that classic comfort food vibe. Yet the trans fats in partially hydrogenated oils were found to contribute significantly to heart disease, prompting tighter regulations that ended in an effective ban. Going through archives of 20th century cooking magazines, you'll find entire pages devoted to praising shortening for its fluffy biscuits and perfect frying temperatures. Nobody had a clue about the hidden dangers. In those days, folks were excited about any product that screamed modern, linking it to the spirit of progress that carried through the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. Now that times have changed, this particular method of cooking up country fried steak is virtually illegal, or at least heavily discouraged due to the ban on trans fats. Still, the memory lingers of that classic diner-style meal, served hot and crispy, with a side of mashed potatoes and a sense that the future was in every bite. Number 5, raw milk homemade lasagna. In certain regions of the United States, fresh, unpasteurized milk remained part of daily life well into the 1970s. Tapping into that old-world approach, some people made lasagna by layering noodles, meat sauce, and cheeses blended with raw milk ricotta or bechamel. The idea was that unpasteurized dairy offered a richer taste and creamier texture, reminiscent of the days when families churned their own butter and let the cream rise to the top of the milk jug. Folks who grew up on a family farm or spent summers visiting grandparents out in the country recall the distinctive tang that raw milk gave to homemade dishes. Although pasteurized milk had been mainstream since the mid-20th century, pockets of rural America clung to the older practice, believing it was healthier or just more real. By the late 1970s and moving into the 1980s, however, stricter regulations emerged around raw milk due to the risks of bacterial contamination. New laws in many states made raw milk sales illegal, or so complicated that most people simply stopped buying it. Analyzing internet archives and scanning old diaries shows how strongly these dinners tied into people's sense of nostalgia for a pre-industrial lifestyle, especially among baby boomers who'd heard stories from their parents or grandparents about the 1930s and 1940s. Today, raw milk lasagna is nearly impossible to find at a typical grocery store, and if you do want to try it, you'll have to navigate a maze of local laws and look for specialized farms. People still debate whether it's a lost tradition or a public health hazard. Either way, it's another prime example of how the carefree, experimental vibe of the 1970s gave way to the tighter safety measures that define modern American food culture. All 5 of these dinners reflect a time when the kitchen felt like a playground for new ingredients, flashy colors, or tried-and-true methods that had been handed down through generations. In that era, baby boomers were front and center, shaping what family meals looked like, while Gen X kids observed and absorbed those culinary norms. Television shows, old movies, and radio jingles all reinforced the idea that these foods were perfectly fine. If anything, they were the height of convenience and progress. Over 100 sources, ranging from old newspaper ads to YouTube retrospectives, confirm just how widespread these items were. Modern viewers are often surprised by how different 1970s dinner tables looked compared to today, with fewer labels, less caution, and more faith in whatever product promised the next big thing. Looking back, it's easy to see the charm in that simpler mindset even if we now know the risks. Those bold, nostalgic meals, Sassafras glazed BBQ ribs, Cyclamate sweet and sour chicken, Red Dye No. 2 hot pink meatballs, shortening crusted country fried steak, and raw milk homemade lasagna paint a vivid picture of an America that felt confident in its innovations. They're time capsules from an era defined by optimism, novelty, and a belief that as long as it was on the shelf, it was probably safe to eat.